A single warship in the early American Navy required the destruction of 60 acres of old-growth forest. 60 acres. Trees that had been standing since before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, cut down so that a nation barely 50 years old could defend itself at sea. And here is the part nobody thinks about. Those trees didn't arrive at a shipyard on a truck. There were no railroads. There were no highways. In many cases, there weren't even roads. So the shipyard came to the trees. Americans built warships in the middle of forests, on riverbanks, in clearings hacked out of wilderness so dense that sunlight couldn't reach the ground. The story of American shipbuilding is not a story about shipyards. It's a story about forests, about the men who walked into timber stands that had never been touched by an axe, who looked at a living tree and saw a keel, a mast, a hull plank, and about the brutal, dangerous, often fatal labor of turning a forest into a fleet. This is how America built ships from trees that were still growing in the forest, and the cost of doing it was staggering. To understand why American shipbuilding looked the way it did, you first have to understand what American forests looked like before anyone started cutting them down. Because the forests that European settlers encountered on the eastern seaboard of North America were unlike anything that existed in Europe. Nothing even close. England, by the 1600s, had already stripped most of its old-growth timber. The great oak forests that once covered the British Isles had been felled over centuries for fuel, for construction, for charcoal production, and for the Royal Navy itself. The demand was relentless. A single 74-gun ship of the line consumed roughly 6,000 trees in its construction. England was building dozens of these vessels every decade, and the forests simply couldn't keep up. By the time the first colonists landed in Virginia, England was importing timber from Scandinavia and the Baltic states just to keep its fleet afloat. The homeland couldn't grow trees fast enough to replace what the Navy devoured. But America was something else entirely. The eastern forests of North America stretch from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River in an unbroken canopy so vast that, according to early accounts, a squirrel could theoretically travel from Maine to Georgia without ever touching the ground. White pines in New England grew to heights of 200 feet or more, with trunks 5 and 6 feet in diameter at the base. These trees had been growing since the Crusades. Live oaks in the southern colonies grew in twisted, spreading shapes so naturally curved that a single tree could yield frames and knees perfectly suited to a ship's hull without any steam bending required. White oaks across the mid-Atlantic stood so thick that a man could walk for days and never leave their shade. The canopy was so dense in some places that the forest floor was bare earth. No undergrowth, no grass, just centuries of accumulated leaf litter under a ceiling of branches that blocked the sky. These weren't ornamental trees. These were ancient organisms, some of them 1,000 years old, with root systems that had been pulling nutrients from the same soil since the Viking Age. And to a shipwright standing on the shore of colonial Massachusetts, staring into that forest, in every single one of those trees was a ship waiting to be born. The British understood this immediately. In fact, one of the primary economic motivations for colonizing North America in the first place was timber. The Crown looked at those forests and saw masts. They saw keels. They saw an end to their humiliating dependence on Baltic imports. And they were right. The white pines of New England were the finest mast timber in the known world. A single trunk could be shaped into a mainmast for a first-rate ship of the line, something that required splicing together multiple smaller trees in European shipyards. A spliced mast was weaker than a single-piece mast, which meant American timber gave the Royal Navy a genuine structural advantage. But turning a living forest into a functioning warship was a process so labor-intensive, so physically punishing, and so dangerous that the men who did it deserve to be remembered alongside anyone who ever served on the ships they built. The process started with selection. And selection was an art form that took decades to master. A timber surveyor, sometimes called a mast agent or timber cruiser, would walk into the forest months or even years before any cutting began. His job was to identify which trees would serve which purpose. This was not a casual assessment. A ship required dozens of different timber profiles, and every piece had to meet exacting specifications or the vessel would fail at sea. The keel, the structural backbone of the entire vessel, needed to be cut from a single piece of timber as long as possible, perfectly straight, free of knots, and dense enough to resist the constant pressure of the sea. White oak was preferred. The surveyor would walk among the oaks, studying the bark for signs of internal rot. Checking the surrounding soil for drainage patterns that might have weakened the wood, pressing his ear against the trunk and tapping it with the back of an axe. A solid trunk rang like a drum. A rotten one thudded like a sack of wet sand. A skilled surveyor could tell you the condition of a tree's heartwood without cutting it, just from the sound, the bark pattern, and the way the crown grew. Mass required the straightest, tallest trees in the forest. White pines specifically. A surveyor looking for mass timber was looking for trees that had grown in dense stands, competing with their neighbors for sunlight, which forced them to grow straight up rather than branching out. The ideal mass pine was at least 24 inches in diameter at the base and 72 feet long with no significant branching in the lower 2/3 of its height. A trunk with even a slight curve was rejected. A trunk with a hidden knot that might crack under the stress of full sail was a death sentence for the crew who sailed under it. Finding one perfect mast tree was difficult. Finding the dozens required for a full-rigged warship was a project that could take a year or more. Hull planking required timber that could be cut into long, wide boards without splitting. Frames and ribs needed naturally curved pieces, which meant finding trees that had grown on hillsides or at the edge of clearings where wind and gravity had shaped their trunks into gentle arcs over centuries. Knees, the L-shaped brackets that connected deck beams to the hull, were cut from the junction where a major branch met the trunk, and a good knee tree, one with the right angle and sufficient size, was worth more than a straight one. The surveyor would mark each tree with chalk or blaze marks, noting what it was destined to become. Then he would return months later with a felling crew, and the real work would begin. Felling a tree that has been growing for 500 years is not like cutting down a tree in your backyard. These were organisms the size of small buildings. A mature white pine destined for a Royal Navy mast might weigh 10 tons or more while still standing. A large live oak could weigh twice that, because live oak is one of the densest woods in North America, so heavy it sinks in fresh water. Cutting one down with hand tools, axes, and two-man crosscut saws was a full day's work for a team of experienced men working in coordination. The danger was constant and unpredictable. Old-growth trees don't always fall where you expect them to. Centuries of growth create internal stresses in the wood, invisible tensions locked inside the grain, and when the saw cuts through those stress points, the tree can twist, split, or kick back with lethal force. A phenomenon called a barber chair, such where the trunk splits vertically before the cut is complete, sending half the tree shooting backward like a battering ram, killed fellers regularly. There was no warning. The wood would scream, a high-pitched crack that lasted less than a second, and then tons of timber would be moving in a direction no one predicted. The men had a saying for it. You could hear the tree thinking about which way to fall. And sometimes it thought wrong. Once the tree was on the ground, the real logistical nightmare began. You now had a log weighing 5, 10, sometimes 20 tons lying on the forest floor, potentially miles from the nearest navigable water, and you needed to move it, every single inch. In winter, this was done on ox-drawn sledges over frozen ground. The frost hardened the soil enough to support the weight, and ice reduced friction. Teams of 12 to 20 oxen, harnessed in pairs, driven by teamsters who walked alongside cursing and coaxing with voices that carried through the frozen woods, would drag a single mast log out of the forest at a pace of about 1 mile per hour. On a good day. The roads, such as they were little more than cleared paths with the stumps cut low enough for the sledge runners to pass over them. If the temperature rose unexpectedly and the ground thawed, the sledge would sink to its rails in mud and the entire operation would stop. Days of work lost. Men and animals standing in the cold waiting for the ground to freeze again. Mast logs presented a unique problem because of their extraordinary length. A 70-foot log doesn't turn corners well. Special wider clearings had to be cut at every bend in the mast road, and even then, getting a log around a curve required unhitching some of the oxen, repositioning them at angles, and using block and tackle rigs chained to standing trees to pivot the log through the turn. A single mast could take a week to travel 10 miles from stump to water. In summer, shorter timber was moved by water. Logs were rolled to the nearest stream or river, sometimes by prying them with iron bars and sheer human force down muddy embankments and floated downstream to the shipyard or collection point. The rivers of New England and the mid-Atlantic were highways for timber, and during the spring floods, when snow melt swelled the waterways to their widest and deepest, or thousands of logs would be released into the current at once in what were called log drives that could stretch for miles along a single river. River driving was its own form of dangerous, terrifying work. Logs would jam against rocks, against each other, against the riverbanks. The men who broke these jams, the river drivers, walked out onto floating masses of interlocked timber with nothing but a peavey, a pole with a hooked metal tip, and their sense of balance. When a key log was freed, the jam could release all at once, thousands of tons of timber surging forward in the current. If you weren't off the pile before that happened, you went under it. Drowning was the leading cause of death among river drivers, and the bodies were not always recovered. And every one of these operations was performed by human beings and animals working at the absolute edge of their physical capacity. The men who felled the timber, moved the timber, and shaped the timber were a mix of colonial farmers working for winter wages, indentured servants desperate for any employment, enslaved people in the southern colonies who had no choice at all, and a small cadre of professional woodsmen who followed the timber trade from season to season. Their names, almost without exception, are lost to history. The ships they built are in museums. Their graves, if they had graves, are unmarked. Now, when all of this effort just got the raw materials to the building site, the actual construction of the ship was a separate universe of skill, labor, and danger. But here is what made American shipbuilding fundamentally unique. In Europe, particularly in England, ships were built in permanent, well-established shipyards. These were large industrial facilities with stone dry docks, covered saw pits, dedicated rope walks stretching hundreds of yards, tool stores, and barracks for workers. Timber arrived at the yard from somewhere else, already rough cut and properly seasoned. The shipwrights worked in a controlled environment with established supply chains. In America, especially in the early colonial period and through the Revolution, ships were frequently built where the timber was. The shipyard came to the forest because it was easier to build a temporary construction site near the trees than to transport thousands of tons of green timber overland to a distant coast. Joshua Humphreys, the Philadelphia Quaker who designed the original 6 frigates of the United States Navy, including the famous USS Constitution, specified live oak for the frames because of its extraordinary density and resistance to rot and marine borers. But live oak grew almost exclusively on the sea islands of Georgia and the coastal lowlands of the Carolinas and Florida. It didn't grow in Philadelphia or Boston, where the major shipyards were. So the Navy sent cutting crews to those islands, and the timber was roughed out right there in the swamps, shaped with adzes and broadaxes on the spot, before being loaded onto transport vessels and shipped north to the assembly yards. The conditions on those sea island cutting operations were almost incomprehensible by any modern standard. The climate was subtropical. The air was so thick with heat and humidity from March through November that men would soak their shirts in seawater just to stay functional. The swamps were breeding grounds for mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever, diseases that killed more workers than any falling tree ever did. Alligators lived in the same waterways where timber was floated. Venomous snakes, cottonmouths, and rattlesnakes and coral snakes were a daily hazard. Men working barefoot in standing water, which many of them did, couldn't see what they were stepping on. And the work itself was backbreaking beyond description. Live oak is so dense that a cubic foot of it weighs nearly 75 pounds. Cutting it with hand tools was like trying to chop through stone. An axeman working live oak would dull his blade in an hour and burn through multiple handles in a week from the force of repeated impacts. The men who did this work suffered chronic injuries to their shoulders, elbows, backs, and hands. Repetitive strain turned their joints into constant sources of pain. Many of them were enslaved, and their suffering was compounded by the fact that they had no choice in the matter, received nothing for their labor, and had no right to stop even when injured. But the live oak they cut was extraordinary material. The frames of the USS Constitution, cut from live oak harvested on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, were so dense and so tough that British cannonballs literally bounced off them during the War of 1812. That's how she earned the name Old Ironsides. The iron in question was wood. Wood cut by men whose names nobody recorded, from trees that had been growing on those islands for centuries before the first English ship ever crossed the Atlantic. The construction process itself followed a sequence that hadn't changed much since the shipyards of ancient Phoenicia. The keel was laid first, a single massive timber or a series of scarf timbers bolted together with copper that formed the spine of the entire vessel. Then the stem and stern post were raised at each end, defining the ship's profile. Next came the frames, the skeletal ribs that gave the hull its shape, each one individually cut and shaped from naturally curved timber using adzes, broadaxes, chisels, and augers. Every frame had a slightly different curve. The hull of a ship is not a simple shape. It's a compound curve that changes continuously from bow to stern, and each frame had to match its specific position along that curve with precision measured in fractions of an inch. The shipwrights who did this work didn't use computers. They didn't use precision machinery. They used skill accumulated over 7-year apprenticeships that began when they were boys. The ability to look at a piece of curved timber and see the shape of a hull rib within it. They worked with chalk lines, on thin board molds, and the educated judgment of their own hands. And they were right, frame after frame, ship after ship, for generations. Once the frames were up, the hull was planked. Long boards of white oak or white pine were steamed in timber boxes over boiling water to make them pliable, then bent around the frames and fastened with wooden tree nails, tapered hardwood pegs driven through precisely drilled holes. Tree nails were preferred over iron nails for much of the hull, because they swelled when wet, creating a tighter seal, and they didn't corrode in salt water the way iron did. A single hull might require 20,000 or more tree nails, each one turned on a lathe and driven by hand. The planking gangs worked in conditions that would shut down a modern construction site immediately. The steam planks were scalding hot and had to be wrestled into position quickly before the wood cooled and became rigid again. Men handled them with bare hands or minimal cloth wrapping. The bending had to happen fast, with the entire crew coordinating to force a 100-pound board against the frames. If a plank cracked during bending, which happened regularly, the process started over with a new piece of timber that might take days to prepare. Men were burned, crushed by falling planks, and cut by tools slipping on wet wood. The noise was deafening. Mallets, caulking irons, adzes, saws, and the constant groaning of wood under stress created a wall of sound that left many shipyard workers partially deaf by the time they were 40. Caulking was another critical and hazardous step that consumed weeks of labor on every vessel. After the planks were fastened, the seams between them had to be sealed to make the hull watertight. Every seam, every joint, on every gap where two pieces of wood met. A frigate's hull contained miles of seams, and every inch of every one had to be packed tight, or the ship would leak and eventually sink. Caulkers drove strands of oakum, loose hemp fiber picked apart from old rope by hand into every seam using a caulking iron and a heavy mallet, thousands of blows per day, day after day, until the entire hull was packed tight. Then the seams were sealed with hot pitch. The pitch was heated in iron kettles over open fires right there in the shipyard, sometimes just feet from the wooden hull under construction. These kettles could hold hundreds of gallons of molten pitch at temperatures exceeding 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Spills were common. Fires were common. Burns were, according to period accounts, treated as routine workplace injuries, meaning a burned hand was wrapped in whatever cloth was available and the man went back to work. Pitch fires. When a kettle overturned or a spark ignited the fumes rising from the surface, could engulf an entire section of the yard in minutes. The thick black smoke from burning pitch was acutely toxic, and men caught in it suffered lung damage that shortened their lives. And pitch brings us to another entire industry that was essential to every wooden vessel ever launched, an industry equally brutal and even more forgotten: naval stores. The production of tar, pitch, turpentine, and rosin from the pine forests of the southern colonies. The longleaf pine forests of the Carolinas and Georgia were the primary source of American naval stores throughout the colonial and early national periods. The production process was primitive and harsh. Workers, the vast majority of them enslaved, would cut V-shaped grooves called cat faces into the bark of living pine trees. The resin that oozed from these wounds was collected in clay pots or wooden boxes placed at the base of the trunk. A single tree could be tapped for several years before it was exhausted. When enough resin had accumulated, it was scraped out and carried in barrels to a tar kiln, an earthen pit lined with clay where the resin was slowly cooked over a bed of burning pine knots for 48 to 72 hours until it rendered into thick, dark tar. The kilns burned continuously and had to be monitored around the clock. A kiln tender who let the fire burn too hot would destroy the batch. One who let it burn too cold would produce unusable product. The work was done in the open air in the Carolina heat, surrounded by choking smoke and fumes that burned the eyes and throat. The resin itself was a severe skin irritant, and prolonged daily exposure caused chronic dermatitis that left workers' hands cracked, bleeding, and permanently discolored. If a kiln was poorly constructed, or the earth shifted during the burn, it could collapse inward, unburying the tender in a mixture of burning earth and molten tar that reached temperatures hot enough to melt flesh. Turpentine production was even more hazardous. Raw resin was distilled in copper stills, essentially the same equipment and process used to make whiskey, and the distillation produced highly flammable vapors that accumulated in enclosed spaces. Still explosions were not uncommon, and when a turpentine still blew, the blast of flaming liquid and superheated vapor could kill everyone within 100 feet. The workers who tended these stills knew the risk. They had no choice but to accept it. The men and women who produced naval stores, who kept the American and British fleets waterproof and preserved, who ensured that every seam on every ship held against the pressure of the Atlantic, have been almost entirely erased from the standard telling of shipbuilding history. But without their labor, no wooden ship ever built could have stayed afloat for more than a few months. Now, there's a political dimension to all of this that shaped American history in ways most people never learn about in school. And it starts with a symbol, an arrow. In 1691, the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter included a provision known as the Broad Arrow Policy. The Crown decreed that any white pine tree measuring 24 inches or more in diameter, growing on land not previously granted to a private owner, which was the property of the king, reserved exclusively for the Royal Navy. The king's surveyors would walk through the forest of New England and mark these trees with 3 hatchet blows arranged in the shape of a broad arrow, the official symbol of Crown property. Cutting down a broad arrow tree was a criminal offense punishable by a fine of 100 pounds, an enormous sum in the colonial economy, enough to bankrupt a small farmer. The policy was designed to ensure that the finest mass timber in North America went to the British fleet and nobody else. Not the colonists, not rival navies, not private shipbuilders. The king's trees for the king's ships. The colonists despised it with a fury that is hard to overstate. To a farmer who had cleared his own land with his own hands, who had spent years removing stumps and building a homestead in the wilderness, is the sight of a Crown surveyor walking onto his property and marking his trees with a government stamp was an act of provocation that bordered on a declaration of war. These colonists had come to America, in many cases, specifically to escape the kind of arbitrary authority that the broad arrow represented. And here it was, stamped into the bark of their own trees. And they resisted it in every way they could devise. Sawmill operators would cut marked trees into random width boards in the middle of the night, destroying their value as masts, but producing perfectly good lumber for houses and barns. Farmers would girdle broad arrow trees, cutting a ring of bark around the trunk to kill the tree slowly, so that by the time the king's surveyor returned months later, the tree was standing dead and no longer suitable for the Navy, but the farmer could claim it was natural. Others simply felled the trees openly and dared the authorities to do something about it in a frontier community where everyone was armed and the nearest court was 100 miles away. In 1772, a confrontation in the town of Weir, New Hampshire, known as the Pine Tree Riot, saw a group of colonists attack a sheriff and his deputies who had come to arrest sawmill owners for cutting broad arrow pines. The rioters beat the sheriff, unshaved the manes and tails of his horses in a deliberate gesture of humiliation, and drove the entire party out of town with threats of worse if they returned. It was one of the earliest acts of organized violent colonial resistance to British authority, predating the Boston Tea Party by nearly a year, and it was fought over trees. The broad arrow wasn't the cause of the American Revolution, but it was a grievance that cut deep, literally and figuratively. The principle it represented? That the natural resources of America existed to serve the British Crown, that a colonist couldn't cut a tree on his own frontier because a king 3,000 miles away wanted it for a mast, was the same principle that drove opposition to the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and every other assertion of imperial control. The forests of America weren't just a shipbuilding resource. They were a political battleground where the question of who owns this land was fought with axes before it was fought with muskets. When the Revolution came, those same forests became a strategic asset of the First Order. The Continental Congress understood that without a navy, the war could not be won, and without timber, there was no navy. American shipyards, many of them hastily constructed on riverbanks and lake shores in the wilderness, began producing warships at a pace that astonished even the British Admiralty. On Lake Champlain, Benedict Arnold, before his infamous betrayal, oversaw the construction of an entire fleet from scratch in the wilderness at Skenesboro, now Whitehall, New York. The ships were built from timber felled within walking distance of the building site, by shipwrights working alongside Continental soldiers and local farmers who had never built anything larger than a barn. They constructed vessels from green wood, timber so freshly cut that sap still ran from the planks, and the smell of raw pine filled the lakeside air. These weren't elegant ships. They were rough, crude, leaking, and built under conditions of absolute desperation. But they floated, and they fought. At the Battle of Valcour Island in October 1776, Arnold's forest-built fleet engaged a vastly superior British force and fought them to a standstill long enough that the British withdrew to winter quarters rather than continuing their advance south. That delay, purchased with green wood ships, and the lives of the men who sailed them, gave the Continental Army a full additional year to prepare. It may have saved the Revolution. And it was made possible because America had forests and men willing to destroy them fast enough to build a fleet in weeks. The men who built those ships did it knowing the vessels might last one season at best. Green wood warps as it dries. Green wood cracks along the grain as internal moisture escapes. Green wood rots when exposed to standing water, which is a serious problem for a ship. A vessel built from unseasoned timber was living on borrowed time from the moment its hull touched the lake. But there was no time to season timber properly, a process that could take 2 to 3 years for large structural pieces. The war demanded ships now, and the forest provided them now, and the men who did the building accepted that their work was temporary by design. What mattered was that it floated long enough to fight. This pattern, forests becoming fleets under desperate pressure, repeated itself throughout the early Republic. When Congress authorized the construction of the first 6 frigates of the permanent United States Navy, the search for suitable timber became a national project spanning the entire eastern seaboard. Cutting parties were dispatched to Georgia's Sea Islands for live oak, to the forests of Maine for white pine masts, to the oak stands of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Virginia for hull planking. And the USS Constitution alone required approximately 1,500 trees. 60 acres of old-growth forest gone for one ship. Her live oak frames came from St. Simon's Island, Georgia. Her white pine masts came from Unity, Maine. Her hull planking came from forests in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Her keel was white oak from the mid-Atlantic states. Her copper-bottom sheathing was rolled in Paul Revere's foundry in Canton, Massachusetts. But every piece of metal on that ship was secondary to the wood. The copper protected the wood. The iron bolts held the wood together. The whole purpose of every non-wooden component was to serve the timber. She was, in a very real sense, a floating map of America's eastern forests. Every piece of her hull a tree that had stood for centuries before. A surveyor looked at it and saw a warship. Her construction took nearly 3 years and employed hundreds of workers at the Hart shipyard in Boston. The live oak for her frames had to travel over 1,000 miles by sea from Georgia, and shipments were frequently delayed by weather, by the difficulty of loading timber so heavy it threatened to capsize the transport vessels, and by outbreaks of yellow fever among the cutting crews that left entire work camps too sick to function. At one point, the Navy was so desperate for live oak that it offered bounties to private citizens willing to cut and deliver it. A measure that tells you how difficult and dangerous the work was if the government had to bribe people to do it, and the men who built her, the axemen who felled the timber, the sawyers who shaped it, the teamsters who dragged it through frozen woods behind straining oxen, the shipwrights who framed the hull by hand, the caulkers who sealed every seam with oakum and boiling pitch, the enslaved laborers who cut the live oak in Georgia's fever swamps. Most of them were never named in any official record. The ship is in a museum in Boston. The trees are studied in ecology textbooks. The builders are ghosts. By the mid-1800s, the age of wooden shipbuilding was already fading. Iron and then steel would replace timber as the primary material for hulls and frames, and the great forests that had supplied the fleet for 2 centuries were by then severely depleted. The white pines of New England that had once reached 200 feet were nearly gone, cut first for the King's Navy and then for the Republic's. The live oak stands of the Sea Islands had been harvested so aggressively that the Navy established its own timber reservations on the islands, setting aside land where no cutting was permitted. These were among the earliest federal land conservation efforts in American history, and they were driven not by environmental conscience, but by military panic, the genuine fear of running out of the one material that kept the fleet afloat. The transition from wood to iron didn't happen in a single moment. It happened gradually, reluctantly, and with genuine grief among the shipwrights who had spent their lives mastering the art of turning trees into vessels. A man who had served a 7-year apprenticeship learning to shape a hull frame from a naturally curved oak limb, using nothing but an adze and his eye, a man who could look at a timber and see the ship inside it, found himself by the 1860s watching ironworkers rivet plates together to achieve the same shape in a fraction of the time. The skill that had taken him a decade to acquire was obsolete within a generation. There is something particularly cruel about that kind of obsolescence. The knowledge didn't transfer. You couldn't take a master shipwright who understood the grain of white oak, who could feel the tension in a plank being bent around a frame, who knew by sound whether a tree nail had seated properly, and put him to work in an iron foundry. The two trades shared a purpose, but nothing else. The wooden shipwright's art died with the men who practiced it, passed down in fragments through journals and apprenticeship records, but never again applied at scale. The last generation of master shipwrights took their knowledge to the grave, and the world moved on without noticing what had been lost. But what those men accomplished before the Iron Age deserves to be remembered with the seriousness it earned. They walked into forests that had never heard an axe, and they built a navy. They took trees that were old before their grandparents' grandparents were born and turned them into machines of war that protected a young nation's right to exist. They did it with hand tools, with animal power, with their own backs and hands, and the kind of stubborn endurance that doesn't make it into most history books. The cost was enormous, not just in trees, though the forests of eastern North America were fundamentally and permanently altered by the shipbuilding era. The cost was measured in human bodies, in shoulders destroyed by years of swinging a broadaxe into wood harder than some metals, in lungs blackened by pitch smoke, in lives ended by falling timber, by kiln collapses, by the malaria and yellow fever that festered in the swamps where the best wood grew. In the stolen labor of enslaved men and women who cut the most critical timber of all, the live oak that made old Ironsides invincible and received nothing for it except more of the same suffering tomorrow. Every wooden warship that ever flew the American flag was a collaboration between a forest and the people who dismantled it. The ship could not exist without the tree. The tree could not become a ship without the labor. And the labor, almost without exception, has been forgotten by the country that benefited from it. The next time you see an image of a tall ship under full sail, try to see it the way a timber surveyor would have seen it. Don't look at the finished vessel. See the forest it used to be. See the 60 acres of old-growth timber that were felled, dragged, floated, sawn, steamed, bent, fastened, and caulked to make that single hull possible. See the men standing knee-deep in a Georgia swamp, swinging axes into live oak so hard that sparks flew from the grain. See the oxen straining against the dead weight of a mast log on a frozen road in Maine, their breath smoking in the air while the teamster shouted commands that echoed through trees older than the English language. See the caulker's hands, permanently stained black with pitch, swinging a mallet for 10 hours a day until his shoulders couldn't lift his arms at night. That is the real story of American shipbuilding. It didn't begin in a shipyard. It began in the forest, among trees that had been growing since before anyone in Europe knew this continent existed, and it was paid for by the people who stood between the living tree and the finished hull, who did the work that made everything else possible. Some debts are still owed. The ships are celebrated. The forests are studied. The battles are remembered. But the workers, the ones who turned standing timber into sailing vessels with nothing but blades and muscle, and in willingness to do what the job demanded, they deserve more than the silence that history has given them. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, the kind that refuses to forget the people who did the work, subscribe. I cover the stories of the men, the machines, and the industries that built this country, and the real cost of building it. Click the video on screen now if you want to see what happened next in the story of American industry. I'll see you there.